Hello and welcome to the Fellow Seminar of Observer Research Foundation, where we discuss some of our significant research output that is emanating from this organization. And today we discuss the paper Blue-Green Infrastructure, an opportunity for Indian cities by Saili Udas Mankikar, who is a senior fellow at ORF Mumbai, and Burgess Driver, urban planner working as a project associate at Vatavaran. Burgess is also working on the Biodiversity by the Bay campaign of Mumbai. We have two very eminent discussants for the paper as also for the broader topic. Jayad Hindao, who is the Director, Integrated Urban Planning at WRI, or the World Resources Institute, India, and Olga Chepelianskaya, founder, Unicity. Now, this topic is very close to my heart as this talks of urban natural capital and the ways it can substitute for the physical capital, which often occurs in the forms of accommodative infrastructure, and that have largely been thought of over the last 50, 60 years as a means to combat the impacts of large-scale natural calamities, natural disasters, as also, in fact, lately the impacts of climate change. And these natural calamities might arise as components of the annual ecohydrological cycle or due to the aberrations in the cycle caused by climate change. Now, in 2005, when the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment came up with the delineation and a much better classification of the notion of ecosystem services, that is, the services provided by the ecosystem to the human community through its organic working and free of cost. And the MEA, or the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, classified these services into provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting services. The criticality of the regulating services of the urban natural capital or natural infrastructure, as this paper classifies them as blue-green infrastructure, became more visible and perceptible when successive floods in cities in the developing as also in some of the developed world were witnessed without the right type of sink mechanism existing in the urban space. This is also because of the large-scale land use change leading to losses in wetlands and urban water bodies, or quote-unquote the blue infrastructure as has been classified in this particular research. In many rural areas, in fact, in India as also in large parts of the developing world, accommodative infrastructure like embankments are turning out to have aggravated the disaster impacts. Further, the criticality of green infrastructure lies with other forms of regulating services like carbon sequestration, pollution control, and so on and so forth. And this is where this research intervenes. And that is where the significance of this particular paper lies. And without delving further and without much ado, I think I should stop here and request the authors to make a presentation for around 20 minutes, after which I will invite the two discussants. So, Saili and Burgess, this is over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Karan, can you just share the presentation, please? So while Karan actually puts up the presentation for us, I would like to give you a little bit of a background of why this paper. To begin with, thank you, Jaya, thank you, Olga, and thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for taking out time and looking at our paper. And it's great that we are getting to discuss it, and it's an important topic. We work in the so Burgess was an intern with us when we started working on this paper, and this paper is written from an urbanization, from a city perspective, because we work with the Global Cities program, the urban policy program. So while we were looking at the whole topic of infrastructure, one thing that came up is that the climate hazards are so varied. Right now, as we speak, we have floods happening in several parts of Western India where I come from, and everyone is talking about how are we going to kind of look after this, or how are we going to arrest this? And so we thought that, we looked at global cities, and we looked at, what is happening around, and saw that a lot of urban planning and design approaches are coming up to incorporate nature driven solutions as a counter to conventional infrastructure practices. And this is being done by harnessing blue elements, that is, using the wetlands, the water utilities, the rivers, lakes, seas, alongside the green. And what we thought is that this paper, and we are seeing that about 4 5 cities in India have taken some very active steps towards bringing in the blue with the green, and therefore the blue and green infrastructure. And it was an opportune time for us to explore this emerging concept, analyze the plans and projects in India, and look at global cities, and identify opportunities in the blue green space that could help Indian cities respond to climate hazards, promote equity and resilience, and also catalyze economic transitions for sustainable urban futures. So that was the larger goal in our mind.
So this paper basically explored the emerging concept of BGI and tried to analyze existing plans at the international level and also sought for opportunities in the Indian context. We have the next slide. So to begin with, the outline of the paper indicates a clear focus with respect to understanding the ongoing global transitions in perceptions and practices related to conventional infrastructure, to those which are now beginning to reincorporate natural elements for a pool of proven sustainable benefits. So could we have the next slide? So as the cumulative effects of climate change are becoming increasingly apparent, it is evident that cities the world over will have to accelerate the individual searches for optimizing emission reducing solutions. And in fact, of the 4 major global risks identified by the World Economic Forum to have a negative decadal impact, all relate to the natural environment, and each is bound to further exacerbate the damage to land and water resources, in addition to the obvious damages to life, health, and livelihood, basically. Given that 1 in 2 Indians will be residing in cities by 2050, incremental population strains and the need for shockproofing predominantly brownfield infrastructures and utilities, that dictates the need for major retrofitting or the need for replacement altogether of existing infrastructure. So there's a need to account this and to also balance it out with the environmental deficiencies which are rampant in our cities. Therefore, when we look at haphazard urbanization and unregulated urbanization, when it's coupled with the lack of plan implementation, monitoring, and evaluation protocols, and this has been constant since the past 2 to 4 10 years of town planning practices in major Indian cities. So this has lent a very severe blow to environmental protection. So these aspects perhaps best reflect, decreasing blue and green features across cities. And the extreme case, as you can see here, is Bengaluru, where there is up to a 54% and 3% loss in inherent blue and green features since the past 4 decades. And this was directly an outcome of a 925% increase in built-up areas across the city. We have the next slide, please. So instances and experiences still now dictate a long-standing need for arriving at a middle ground in the endless debate of development versus environment. And here is where the concept of BGI really kicks in. And from an assessment of a preference-based selection of international cities, it was evident that various nuanced considerations, which often go unaccounted for in conventional infrastructure, were mainstream. So as you can see here, we've selected over 5 cities, varying from the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Vancouver, Portland, Wuhan, and Singapore. And each were individually assessed to understand what were the considerations and frameworks which they incorporated to account for dealing with climate change and various localized issues and such. We have the next slide. So some of the major benefits, as I can tell you through the key takeaways, were that incorporating BGI in cities has improved the urban water quality. It's increased urban resilience to sustainable water and stormwater management, and it has enhanced livability all around. by improving natural and urban ecosystems. So, by incorporating various methods to implement blue-green infrastructures and to integrate blue-green infrastructure components like rivers, lakes, streams, ponds, and miscellaneous water bodies, along with forests and grasslands and various other predominant green features, the approach has relied in all cases through methods such as cost-benefit analysis, grading, socioeconomic assessments, guidelines, spatial zoning, and rating systems, with all clearly spelled out strategies that saw promising implementation in these cities. What has remained genuinely clear through these efforts in funding BGI is that the largest scale of the natural blue-green canvas is being retained or being trying to be retained in these cities. And to further explain the Indian angle, I hand over the platform to my colleagues.
Yes. So, what happened is when we started looking at the Indian examples, we thought the approach should not be only looking at cities, but also look at what has happened at the policy level. We did not go too much into depth at the central government and the state government level because it was meant to be a city paper. But we thought let's kind of look at it. So what we found is that environment as such found its the very term environmental protection was only merely mentioned in the fourth 5-year plan from 1964 to 69, where it actually talked about the ideology of environment vis-a-vis a healthy life and how countries around the world are being impacted by environmental issues. However, it took a decade, in 1980 for the Environment Ministry to be formed. And when it was formed, the scope and the ambit of this ministry ranged from air pollution, water pollution, preserving mangroves, forests, and natural resources. It stayed pretty limited. It was only in 2008 when India formulated the National Action Plan on Climate Change, also known as the NAPCC, which was in response to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN's Green Economy Initiative, that we saw some serious movement. There are 12 missions that got formed under the NAPCC, which was a mission for Green India, a national water mission, a sustainable agriculture mission, one on sustainable habitat, on energy efficiency, on wind, on waste to energy, a coastal mission. So we saw that these missions in all were dealing with issues of a sustainable habitat, water, agriculture, forestry. They were all multi-sectoral, they were overlapping and multi-departmental in nature. So they did touch a bit of this whole blue-green infrastructure, process, but not overtly stating it. In addition to the NAPCC, there are two national flagship projects, the Smart Cities Mission and the Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation, also known as the Amrut, which looked at water supply, sanitation, and green space upgradation. And the Smart Cities Mission worked on solutions like sanitation, water supply, preserving open spaces. Sorry, I need to get water. Sorry, 1 minute. Karen, please edit this. 1 minute. I'll just get water. Yes. So, yes, I was on the part where I was saying, so these missions, the Amrut and the Smart Cities mission, looked at solutions like sanitation, water supply, preserving open spaces. So there were some interventions from that. But overall, when we looked at the ministerial approach, and we also looked at the missions, what we saw was there are institutional, systemic, and process barriers, which include financial constraints, interministerial coordination issues, lack of expertise, technical expertise, lack of proper keeping timelines for project clearances. These were major challenges in the efficient implementation of these 12 missions. Also, there is very little synergy between these 12 missions that actually should be there if we want to kind of attain a larger goal. And it's still being looked at in terms of portfolios of ministries operating in different domains. And this definitely impacts the ability to implement policies. Next slide, Karan. So now we look at the cities actually, and we looked at four major cities which are actually touching the whole blue-green infrastructure part of part of things in terms of policy or a master plan, or just incorporating it in that water supply and water sanitation projects. So the first city I'll talk about is Delhi. So Delhi is one of the first cities in India to include a blue-green policy focus in its 2041 master plan. While the details of this policy are still being determined through public consultations, the overarching idea is to ensure that water bodies and green spaces are synchronizingly planned in an independent fashion. There is a 60-layered map that has been drawn out, which actually factors in all these blue-green components. But the problem that we saw after speaking to many people here and reading several news articles, that there is a multiplicity of governing agencies within Delhi, which has resulted in the poor implementation of policies and decisions in the city in the past. And the fear is definitely that while this has been brought into the master plan, we have seen that there is a fear that such multiplicity of agencies governing the city might not allow this to go ahead in the way it's envisaged. In the case of Bhopal, the blue-green plan has been, there is a separate green and blue master plan which has been created in the city through the Smart City mission. And they are trying to kind of link this to the larger master plan of Bhopal, which is the 2021 master plan, which is coming out now. The main goals that they define in this green and blue master plan is to maintain and grow the green cover, to influence citizens' lifestyle indicators, and to promote an environmentally sustainable city. So that is the way it is defined. One of the very good examples that we have projected in the paper, and I think could be talked about more, is the Madurai example. Through the Smart Cities mission, they really took up this program, which was a blue-green program based on people's participation. And their definition was actually very well laid. They said that through, they wanted to institutionalize all the decisions and processes that are in the Mumbai master plan to align with the blue-green plan. They would do this through managing the drainage and sewerage network, cleaning up the lakes, green space development, which were defined as top priorities in the blue-green plan. They said that they would use this to accelerate economic growth via climate compatible development projects. So, and people's participation became the backbone of the Madurai plan, the blue-green plan, where people actually got involved in cleaning of lakes, in looking at the drainage and sewerage network, at looking at the water supply networks. So that's the way Madurai has done it. In case of Bangalore, the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board has actually, again, taken help of an academic institution locally, the IIHS, and some local stakeholders, and conceptualized a blue-green action plan for resource security, climate resilience, and the overall definition is to move towards a low-carbon economy and an ecosystem protection. So they have also drawn out in their master plan 2050 for water supply and sewerage management this whole key drivers in which blue and green forms an important part. So again, they have taken a very different approach through the Bangalore Water Supply and Sewerage Board. So if you look at all the four cities, the approaches are very different, but I think the aim is one, right? And that was an important learning for us that, how do we really need to have, and that's where I'll come next. Karan, can you share the next slide, please? So it is this study that really helped us assess that what is it that is an opportunity for India in this, considering the global examples, the Indian blue-green interventions, the highlights that we saw, and it actually told us that we probably need a multi-pronged, well-planned strategy for blue-green infrastructure would ideally be great as opportunities for cities. So the first opportunity that we drew out was about institutionalizing a blue-green urban framework for us. So the whole idea here was that we saw that several blue-green projects which are successful are actually operating at a more municipal level or a more city level. However, it is important to streamline this and to ensure the integrity of the original blue-green canvas. We felt that there has to be some framework where governments must maintain some uniform statutory terminologies, definitions. They definitely should undertake a comprehensive integration of all urban plans and which record highlight of environmental features. If a framework like this comes into place, then there will be a lot of conformity among all the missions and in all the projects which are incorporated not only at city level but also by parastatal agencies in the cities, and which can percolate down to really small projects. So there is a lack of uniformity which can come through a central framework. The second thing that we thought is important is the way Bangalore and Madurai has also defined it, which is really linking blue-green infrastructure to the economic agenda. So what we thought is every project, and this is seen in several global examples, where we need to understand blue-green through a cost-benefit analysis. So a typical blue-green infrastructure project may have several economic benefits, and we need to define those. So for example, health improvement or lesser pollution or better amenities or quality of life improvement or social cohesion. So or even the loss of trees or green spaces, all of this have an economic value, and it definitely should be a part of a economic agenda that we drive. We also felt that this was a great opportunity for cities to kind of fast track the sustainable development goals. So we have seen that developing countries are facing a shortfall of about 124 trillion rupees, or US dollars 1.7 trillion, in financing SDG projects. So in this case, we felt that this was a great opportunity to kind of fulfill multiple targets that are. So for example, if you look at SDG 6, SDG 14 related to water, if you look at SDG 13 related to climate change, I think it all kind of comes in together. So there is an opportunity here. The next thing that we thought is important is how the blue-green concept can really tie into outcome-based planning or outcome-based projects. So it could be a great move. A blue-green concept could help for us to move from input to output by focusing on the outcomes of projects and processes. So which means that the required environmental outcomes or specific level of performance is specified in the framework, and a method to achieve that is also kind of drawn flexibly. So while the outcome can be fixed, the what goes inside can be flexible so that we have a uniform output. We also felt that since cities is even today, I mean, urban planning is given so much importance, and that becomes the kind of a base for a city to develop. We said that blue green could be a foundation for urban planning. So Indian cities must move towards a dynamic urban planning process, which I think some cities like Delhi has already started doing. And they have to include the evolving component like blue-green infrastructure into this dynamic space. There has to be more intensive and transparent digital interfaces of GIS mapping, live tracking, which actually monitors the whole evaluation of blue-green benefits real time. Then we thought that we also started thinking that what is it that has made certain cities do really well? For example, Newcastle, UK, or even like our own cities of Madurai. So we thought that multi-stakeholder, multi-level participation in these projects really makes a huge difference. And therefore, people's participation, community participation, citizen involvement becomes really important, and active interactions with the planners, policymakers, other political representatives does improve citizens understanding of blue green projects and their buy-in and their ownership in the formulation, execution and monitoring of such activities. We also felt that it is time that we look beyond jurisdictions. I know it is so difficult, like every time we say this we said how, but we need to. I mean, it is possible. So for example, the smart cities mission is working with the municipal corporation of Bhopal to really bring this blue green plan out. Or there are different ways in which we can get different bodies, missions, corporations to work together. And if we do not look at this beyond jurisdictions, then we cannot succeed in creating this larger scope of blue-green infrastructure in a city. And the permeability and the dynamic nature of it will be destroyed if we don't go beyond jurisdiction and plan together. Finally, there is a blue-green fund for India, which we feel that now with, there is if we look at blue-green together, there is a large scope for job creation, for stimulating economic and societal progress. We can see a lot of jobs that will get created in agriculture, renewable energy, transportation, manufacturing, which will have blue and green elements, and they have the potential to kind of scale up. Uh, in fact, India is now having has a draft blue economy policy that is being discussed, and there are and that envisions blue resources as multiplier for national growth. So we think that this should be kind of further thought of as a blue green policy, economic policy, and it should take climate change impacts into account at city level. Another thing which came about was digital data governance. We do face a lot of problems in finding data on these on blue and green infrastructure, and there is no single digital inventory available. So we think that the digital inventory, the National Urban Data Bank that is being created, and indicators should definitely include the blue green infrastructure, and also include prospective blue green projects to ensure holistic understanding of the overall benefits. Such data banks will be crucial for not only creating policies but estimating scope of projects, funding and monitoring incomes. Finally, the last opportunity that we kind of found was in sustainable land management. So climate change cannot only be mitigated through greening and reversing land degradation. This will have to be kind of coupled with sustainable land management strategies. So here we are talking about land management strategies which take into account the changing human need, whether it is agriculture, forestry, conservation, and this should be done while ensuring the land's socio-economic and ecological functions over the long term. So how land is utilized will be very, very critical to determining the infrastructure requirements of India's expanding cities. So one good example would be India is the world's largest consumer of groundwater, and this is unsustainable for sure. So how do we kind of bring this into sustainable land management? Next, Karan. So finally, I mean, concluding, it's a very short conclusion, but what we thought is that while the green infrastructure concept has found acceptance in India, India must also consider including blue-green and blue infrastructure in its sustainability transition. Also, there are several scattered attempts that are made in cities across the country and at the central level to introduce blue-green infrastructure aspects for climate adaptation and mitigation. But we need an all-encompassing plan that really acknowledges its cities' economic and social stability, which is dependent on the environment. And existing blue-green resources will be really needed to be planned mindfully for a sustainable future. So that's what our paper really concluded. And thank you very much for tuning in and listening to us. And over to you, Dr. Bush.
Thank you, Saili. Thank you, Burgess. Very interesting presentation of something that is extremely important. There are quite a few issues that have been flagged off as far as your presentation goes, especially, in fact, how, because the way, in fact, you have been talking of an integrated and a systemic approach, and this critically reminds me of conceptualizing the entire city or the landscape as such as a social ecological system. That's how, in fact, it should be looked at. Though, in fact, the usage of the term blue economy has a different connotation altogether, and it's more related to the marine and the associated ecosystem and ecological economic system. Well, with that, in fact, I would like to have the intervention from our esteemed panelists. Let me first turn to Jaya Dhindo for her critical interventions. Over to you, Jaya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ghosh, and congratulations to you, Saili, Burgess, and the team for putting this together. I mean, high time, and this is a fantastic research. Actually, when Saili reached out to me, I said, well, it's very interesting because just a few days ago, I was, reading this with great interest as, WRI is looking to build on the work on nature-based solutions and things of that nature. And we were particularly looking for literature in India, which is pertinent. So congratulations to you for putting this together. So what I would like to, share is just basically expound on, some of the challenges and opportunities that have been presented. You have covered, a lot of ground. You have ticked off all the check boxes, the important sort of the challenges that remain and the barriers that are there, in the ecosystem. And I'm very glad to hear that, you're talking about the systemic approach, right? So because this is what it needs, an integrated approach. So there are a couple of points that I would like to kind of add here. So one, I think, is this notion of absence of a dedicated agency, right? So who takes this on? Multiple agencies, and Saili talked about that. Now, and a lot of the projects are at the city or the regional level, right? Even in your paper. And that's how usually things are with, nature-based interventions. But in India, we know that, regional cooperation is difficult to achieve. There is no sort of an apex body which does that. One of the solutions that, we at WRI are looking at, and this is not in the Indian context, but I'll share it nonetheless, is something called a Joint Benefits Authority. And this is something which is being looked at in San Francisco as a way to kind of bring in some solutions for water utilities and their resilience, right? So the point with that, establishing that authority is that how do you account for the undervalued co-benefits, which accrue to other institutions? So when you talk about blue-green, it's not just the Parks Department or, the Development Authority. It is also the Transit Department. It is, many other departments, which the schools, and all kinds of utilities which benefit from interventions in our water utility system. How do you get them to see that, if I make a change in the water utilities, it impacts, majorly, yes, the direct impacts, but then how do you get them to see the indirect impacts? And, how do you kind of establish those co-benefits? And then the Joint Benefits Authority is looking to kind of become this agency which pools funds, and directs them towards projects by involving all the stakeholders. So this is something that, we are looking and we're experimenting within San Francisco, and we are hoping that there are lessons there which we can bring to the Indian context as well. The second point is about the lack of funding and financing. And I think the main thing that we have to understand there is that this is a political economy issue more than anything, right? So if we don't quantify the eco benefits for each stakeholder, even, so public stakeholders, private stakeholders, and make make the case for it, then those investments will not be directed where they should be. And I remember from my work with city and state level agencies, this was back in the US and in Charlotte, North Carolina, and the city manager had once told me that it is not the case of scarcity of funds; it is a matter of priority. So you need to appeal to them in a way that they prioritize certain actions. The scarcity will always remain, but how do you make that a priority for the city authority or for ULPs and for other state and national level actors is a big thing. The other thing about funding and financing is how do we tap into private sector resources, their financing mechanisms, the innovation that they bring. There are many cases in India also. I mean, outside of India, for example, the wetlands restoration case, Volkswagen has done this in Mexico City. Dow Chemicals has done, artificial wetlands construction, partly for their own benefits, of course, but then partly for the benefit of the city at large, the region at large. There has been adaptive, reuse of mines and quarries by Ambuja Cements, for example. So how do you bring in the private sector financing and innovation to this problem? There are market barriers because there is a perceived lack of, profitable investment. There is perceived low commercial readiness for resilient solutions. The applications in India are very nascent, and that all needs to be looked at. There's low capacity also for climate risk management within our financial systems and governance bodies. But these are the barriers that we also need to talk about because the private sector will represent a huge opportunity to bring in their resources and their innovation to this problem. The fourth thing is about the limited knowledge and awareness that we also talk about within the different stakeholders, within the private sector at large. And really, if you go to a city government now, their biggest question, if you talk to any bureaucrat, is how. So how do you deliver is the biggest question, while the rest of it we can answer, from a theoretical standpoint. And what happens, a lot of what happens is that there's a lack of a holistic approach, and you have standalone projects which result in lost opportunities really. So how do you build the technical capacity among all stakeholders to develop, design, fund, finance, and implement these projects? There's also a lack of meaningful disclosure of climate risks. So, there's insufficient availability, adoption of climate risk data and tools. You spoke about data a lot, Saili. And then the third thing I think that we don't talk about enough is indigenous knowledge, right? So there are these informal mechanisms that we've always had. We used to, worship rivers. There are these concepts of sacred groves, which are there in India from a long time back. And we can look at how these solutions, how this institutional knowledge, indigenous knowledge can, be built upon and contribute to building awareness in this domain. So that's one. The fifth thing is on land constraint. India is land constrained, we know that. And, things will just get worse as we progressively, become more urbanized and, how do you manage the land, right? So one is to expand on the pollution impacts, so not just talking about the air and water pollution, but also the land pollution. The solid waste management issue in this case, and how do you kind of work, towards resolving that? Because, landfills and irregular dump sites eat up a lot of this valuable land, and how do you kind of address that pollution as well? And in terms of the land itself, I mean, there are examples. For example, Stuttgart has a green roof policy, which is looking to incentivize BGI and, NBS at individual levels, right? So, in Bangalore, and so when the land is constrained, they're looking at these green roof policy and how do you incentivize individual owners to kind of develop those on their plots. In Bangalore, actually, in addition to the startling data that you showed, I mean, I live in Bangalore, so 85% of the BlueGreen infrastructure is actually encroached upon, right? So whatever is there, I mean, one is it's been eaten up and then the rest has been encroached upon. So now within those constraints, how do you ensure within that constraint, the land constraint, how do you kind of put in BGI infrastructure, nature-based solutions in a city like that? And a related thing is, maintenance and operations, so after you put into place a BGI component or an nature-based solution, who manages it, who maintains it? Does it fall in the public realm, in the private realm? Again, how do you incentivize private stakeholders to take on some of these responsibilities? And how do you find anchors within existing institutional frameworks who can kind of address that and look at that? And I think my final comment really would be on the policy and regulatory provisions, which you have talked about, very nicely in this paper as well. And I think the thing that needs to be talked about here is that BGI, not just as part of dynamic planning, but also as part of strategic plans, and also the scales of plans in cities, which we have not been able to, establish in most of our cities. So the third level scale of plan, the ward level or the local area level plan, offers a tremendous opportunity to kind of institute some of these measures and as a means to deliver these strategic projects in cities. So when you're talking about the blue-green urban framework, I think we should talk about the integrated regulatory framework, which will support the BGI, the blue-green infrastructure, so that basically actions and objectives across these various plans are harmonized. So typically in the West, where you have mayor-led governments, the mayor sets the agenda for the year, and all departments, follow a certain objective which the city sets out for itself as being important. So, how do you bring that? How do you bring the integrated regulatory framework to Indian cities? How do you ensure the master plan, the mobility plan, other plans are speaking the same language? Like you said, one is from a vocabulary standpoint, but also from the standpoint of objectives. So yes, this is, I'll stop here, but these were some of the inputs that I wanted to offer. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jaya. That's fabulous. Fantastic intervention on the paper. I mean, brought about a host of external dimensions, and which essentially this paper can build upon in future research, as also they are in fact implicit in the paper. So thanks for bringing that in fact at the front, because I'm thoroughly impressed with this idea, this critical institutional void that exists. The way in fact you put this across, and the undervaluation as also the co-benefits. Interestingly, I am also reminded of, the way, in fact, we should be valuing these services provided by the blue-green infrastructure, especially the values of the ecosystem services, essentially the regulating and the provisioning and the other supporting services that they are providing. Now, who should be paying for those? The beneficiaries, and who are the benefactors in the process? Suppose say only if we can have a case like New York, where you have the Catskill watershed and the indigenous community in the Catskill watershed actually protecting that particular resource, and then eventually you can make the beneficiaries in the city of New York or the municipal corporation out there paying them, then possibly such a thing can be incentivized to a large extent. So can we do that, in fact, for protecting our wetlands? Just as you mentioned the example of Bangalore, here also, I stay in Kolkata over the last 6-7 years. And the East Kolkata wetlands have been encroached. We have lost out on some of the very critical services, including the fisheries out there. Apart from the flood regulation and the carbon sequestration and other things, because it's shrinking, the wetland by itself is shrinking. So with that, in fact, let me come to Olga for her interventions. Olga, this is over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Nilanjan. Thank you very much to all of you, to the Observer Research Foundation, for having me a part of this panel. It's been really exciting to learn the progress that Indian cities have made over the last few years in terms of including green and blue infrastructure. So I went with big interest through Sailis and Berge's paper, and it was great to hear your insights today. And also the points that Jai has brought in are very important in terms of how do we practically support this going forward further. So what I'm going to do is to bring a little bit of an Asian perspective, because we at Unicity work at the Asian scale, to see what are the cross learnings that we can share here. Really, I think it's the right time to delve into this topic more, with the UN just entering the decade of the ecosystem restoration. So I think many dots can be connected to act more impactfully going further. And these are the few points that I will want to make. So I will take the topic of green and blue ecosystems from the perspective of climate resilience, and also show how climate resilience actually can generate more livability when approached through blue and green ecosystems. A quick word about Unicity. So Unicity stands for uniqueness in cities. And in fact, since the inception, since 2017, we've been working on activating unique natural and cultural assets in cities. So this is a theme that is very, very dear to us. We've worked in about 20 cities thus far and continuing doing so. Why blue and green ecosystems? So all of you know that Asia is urbanizing fast. So if you were less than 40% of urban dwellers in Asia in 2000, we already more than half now and heading to over 65% by 2050. In addition to this, we have climate change that heavily affects Asia. So if you look at the IPCC global warming projections, then as per the business as usual scenario, to which we are still very close to, we are likely to have up to 4 degrees of global warming by 2100. Even if it is a more optimistic scenario, then we are still heading towards 2 or 3 degrees of global warming. And that has a huge effect on our territories and on cities, with Asia really being at the forefront. So if you look at the left-hand side map, you can see that the coastal flooding is significantly likely to affect specifically Asia in the future, and to a large extent Africa as well. Asian cities are at the forefront of these disasters precisely because of a number of points that have been mentioned in this panel today. One of them is encroaching upon blue and green ecosystems that no longer play their protective role. And in fact, India is very much at the forefront of population exposed to river floods. So we looked at coastal floods and now coming to river floods. Again, really being at the top of vulnerability when coming to the number of people that are likely to be affected. So clearly there is action required here. And one very important point is that Asia and India in particular is very much in the process of building new infrastructure. So when you build infrastructure, you actually make choices for decades to come, because any new building, any new road is not something you will remove the year after. So basically, since this is a McKinsey evaluation, there are similar ones which come to the same numbers. Asia is really building fast, India is building fast, and especially the next decade and the next couple of decades are absolutely critical into how the country will be facing future challenges related to climate change. So whatever we build today is choices we make for decades. And if we do sacrifice our green and blue ecosystems, this is something we'll have to pay henceforward. On the other hand, it is also an opportunity, because if we do it in a way that benefits us, it will also benefit us for decades. So a couple of advantages that, based on our extensive work with different international institutions, UN agencies, and municipalities, we found really speak in favor of blue and green ecosystem approaches to climate resilience. So first of all, it is cost effectiveness. We all know that in most Asian cities, cost of a project is a number one criteria, simply because there are many needs in a city and there is only a limited budget. And even if we are looking into taking loans from, say, international financial institutions, then a medium Asian city will still be able to take maybe 1 or 2 for a decade. So choice is really critical. Now looking into when we try to jump into engineering solutions first, without looking into what green and blue ecosystems can do, it seems to be a cost trap. So this is what I've seen in a number of cities with which I worked with, but here I took a research example. We are also a think tank, so we do research that supports our projects, which is less sensitive to disclose. So if you look at the city of Mumbai, the city commissioned 8 pumping stations to support flood reduction. And as of now, and that's again a very classical situation in many cities, hardly half of them are still working. You need to invest into new ones. Average cost in here, we calculated, was about $29 million. So you keep pouring money into something, and this has a very limited effect without much co-benefits. And this effect is also questionable. On the other hand, we looked into something that has been done by UN Habitat in cooperation with the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Program. And they assessed comparative cost options in the town of Lamy in Fiji. So what was found is that nature-based solutions are by far most cost-effective. However, engineering solutions are also required for an optimal output, optimal protection, and therefore this study concluded that actually you need a mix of them, but you need to put nature-based solutions at the forefront. So savings are tremendous. They've assessed that any Fiji dollar that you spend on nature-based solutions is going to make you savings of up to 20-fold in terms of preventing damages that would come from not taking action. So cost effectiveness, there have been studies on this, is getting incrementally proved, especially when we look into unlocking the potential of green and blue ecosystems as a first step. I'll come to another example on it later. Numerous benefits. So this is something very important, that with one intervention, you can actually make impact in several areas versus just engineering solutions like pumping stations will just do one single intervention, which is remove water. I want us to look into the example of Singapore a little bit. This is a very interesting example because we did an assessment of how climate change unfolded in the city. And so, in fact, over the last 40 years, the temperature got an average warmer by 1.1 degrees. And precipitation also increased by about 500 millimeters a year in average, which is quite a lot over the last 35 years. But however, if you look at this last graph, and here you see that the flooded area, while all this climate change was affecting the city, the flooded area drastically got reduced from 629 hectares to only 40 in 2013. So what is it due to? This is due to the fact that Singapore is really investing into unlocking the potential of its blue and green ecosystems and actually greening the city, while at the same time the population is growing, but also they do it along with unlocking green and blue ecosystems, in particular following the Singapore Green Plan, by which they're aiming at adding 1,000 additional hectares of green spaces by 2035, for example, as one of the measures. So we see that just by these measures alone, they did also a number of engineering solutions, but the main focus is really on protecting and unlocking the potential of green and blue ecosystems. The city is able to mitigate effects of climate change very efficiently. But this is not the only benefit that the city would get, because in addition, by creating these kind of spaces, physical and mental health of citizens is greatly increasing. So the World Health Organization recommends that a city has at least 9 square meters of greenery per citizen. We have another graph somewhere which shows different Asian cities and how much greenery they have. So it's usually much below this. But however, when you respect this, while these ecosystems help you address climate change, they also create a great living environment. And then finally, what is important is that when these are also public spaces, it creates great social cohesion for people from different social backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, to interact, to get to know each other, which overall creates a stronger sense of belonging to the city. And therefore, citizens caring about the city also benefits the overall city's livability and its positive circle that gets engaged. So how do we act to reach such benefits? So a few points I want to share on what we've been trying to do to help cities which proved effective. So first of all, what is important is to do localized climate change projections, because we all know that pretty much every area in Asia gets affected by climate change, but not in a linear and equal manner. So downscaling climate change projections for the intermediate future. So for example, recently we've done it for the city of Baguio in the Philippines, and we've taken the period from 2030 to 2060, which is a reasonable time span for decision makers to plan. And so here, for example, we see that while the interannual precipitation vulnerability historically was varying, but not so strongly, and also not increasing so much, then in the future we see a big increase and huge variability, meaning that in some years floods are really going to be extensive. And this is what city decision makers need to make a decision on where is it that they're going to focus their interventions. To further help decision makers, what really helps out is visualizing the impact of climate change. So here, for example, this is something we've just finalizing for the city of Iloilo, another coastal city of the Philippines. So based on the climate change projections, we would look into how floods will behave in the city. So here we'll use the digital elevation model, we'll use the natural streams, we'll look at the water bodies, and we'll overlay everything on GIS maps to just understand where most vulnerable areas of the city lie. So this allows decision makers to then overlay it with infrastructure maps. So it can be urban infrastructure, it can be social infrastructure, and just to see which areas are already vulnerable. And this is also helping us when we prepare new master plans and city development plans to see which areas are suitable for a specific infrastructure, for residential development, for commercial development, in which areas should not, on the contrary, be developed. Now, the third step is to look what role blue and green ecosystems can play to address the vulnerabilities we've identified. So here, there are a number of ways. In fact, in Asia, one of big issues when working with cities is that data is not easily available. And there are actually ways of collecting data from satellites, from international databases, to create these maps and map as accurately as possible the existing green and blue ecosystems, so that when we overlay it with vulnerability maps, we see which areas we can further enhance. For example, here we see that there is vegetation along the coastal areas, but not in some of them, and these also turn to be most vulnerable to flood and future flood. So based on overlaying these maps, we can actually take informed decisions on where interventions should lie. And then finally, of course, to enact all of this, as was already said by panelists, we provide recommendations, and these need to start with planning and institutional recommendations. So institutional recommendations have been covered for India in quite a good extent. I just want to delve quickly on the planning side. So we assessed in detail the example of Taiwan. So Taiwan actually used to focus very much on engineering solutions until the Typhoon Morakot in 2009, which was really extremely damaging for the entire country. So the country took a turn and prepared a set of measures of how to unlock the benefits of blue and green ecosystems so that they address potential vulnerabilities of the future. So for example, ecosystem conservation database was prepared, the watershed management and recovery through ecosystem conservation was established as a plan. Stakeholders were made aware of how conservation can actually prevent disasters. And this was enforced legally, meaning that every city, every territory now needed to look first into how ecosystems could address vulnerabilities before going into engineering solutions. And so when next typhoon of nearly same intensity as Typhoon Morakot hit 6 years later, actually data showed that this typhoon generated 10 times less deaths compared to the first one, and also only half of the economic damages. So this new strategy proved really effective for the country. Very important, again, I won't delve on it much. There was a great example of Madurai. I was going to give a similar example of Batikaloa in Sri Lanka. So this was a UN Habitat project, which fostered cooperation between local authorities and residents to create this green belt to make a protective buffer against floods and sea level rise. And because the community was very much involved, there was again an ownership, which helped maintain the project as well. So stakeholder engagement is a very important step here. Moving forward, once we know what role ecosystems can play, once we know how we enhance this role through planning, and we engage stakeholders, it is of course important also to determine what kind of specific projects can further help. This is something that we did with the city of Surat, with the Cities Development Initiative for Asia and Rockefeller Foundation a few years ago, where we went to the city and we spent time understanding what kind of different infrastructure projects, flood prevention projects the city had. And CDA has a prioritization tool in which, together with decision makers from different departments, we would look into which project meets most potential needs, and this project will then go and linked to finance and get implemented. And finally, I want to conclude with access to finance, which already was mentioned a little bit. But I think we are now at a very right moment with, as I said in the beginning, having entered the UN decade of ecosystem restoration, and with the post-COVID recovery that's being discussed by all the international financial institutions, such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, bilateral financial institutions very actively present in Asia and in India in particular. There are numerous opportunities of preparing projects either for the climate finance institutions, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Adaptation Fund, or to tap into the recovery funding that is available to boost the economy through green interventions. And with nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approach being now increasingly very well regarded, countries and cities really have an opportunity to identify how these can help the city and actually tap into this financing opportunity so that it gets implemented. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Olga, for a wonderful presentation, which essentially touched upon a host of aspects and touched upon a very, very critical debate that, or rather a conflict of paradigms that we are presently facing in India. The holistic solution versus the reductionist engineering-based solutions. And some of the critical problems that we have been facing in the urban cities is precisely because we are, especially as far as the policymaking machinery is concerned, it's more reliant on this, or rather has this reductionist bent of mind that engineering is somehow omnipotent. Well, nature-based solutions, of course, as has been discussed today, has been accepted worldwide, and we are typically moving towards that.
Nanjan, is it okay if I just say a couple of words? I wanted to
yes, please go.
Yes,
please go
interact with Saili a little bit. So Saili, two things. One, the example of Singapore, I completely understand your point. It's very far in terms of institutional setup, financial setup from India and many other developing Asian cities. Now, the reason why we like this example is because it proves that the approach works. Because it is affected by climate change as any other city, but it has managed to bring floods to nearly zero. So this shows that these approaches actually technically do work. And this is an important point to make, I believe, because as Nilanjan was saying, many Asian and Indian cities just doubt that it will work at all. And, you just need to rely on engineering solutions first. So we need that proof, which is good to establish. Another point I thought could be useful is if you look at the Philippines and the comprehensive land use plans, CLUPs. So since 2015, in the Philippines, it became compulsory to integrate disaster risk reduction into land use plans themselves. And this, in our research, because we really look across Asian cities and countries to see what works best, this proves to be quite a turning point, because now it's not only at the project level, once it's more or less too late already to, to integrate green and blue ecosystems, you look at the planning level, which is before the projects, and you see where is it that you can address the challenges. So Philippines is, as India, one of the most affected countries by natural disasters. So maybe this is something that could also be an interesting inspiration point looking at Indian cities.
Thank you, Olga. Excellent intervention. I think the conversation can go on and on. There is no doubt about that, because there is so much to discuss as far as this topic is concerned. But we do have our time constraints, so we have to end. It has to end somewhere, and probably this is the time. And thank you. Thanks all. Thanks to Karan as well for an excellent background support, and Pulkit, of course, for organizing it. Thank you.